So, welcome to this new video. It's a bit of a new genre for me on this channel, at least. Today I'm gonna walk you through how I set up like any basic Python project. Obviously, this is just like core skeleton structure and like very default things that you should do even on your like local projects and like small stuff that you're doing. Obviously, this is like a work project. You might need a bit more of like a robust environment. Very basic, but I think you should never do any Python project without all of those files and with a different structure. And so I'm just going to walk you through that, and it will also be available to download as like a zip file, all the basic files that I'm going to create today. You can just click the link below if you don't want to actually watch the whole tutorial, or if you don't want to like run through the steps every time, because personally that's what I do. Somewhere I have like empty project that every time I want to make a new project in Python, I just copy paste into the new folder, and that way I don't have to like manually every time write the new project. So that's done for you. You can just download it in the description. So let's get started. I'm actually not used to the like camera and tutorial setup. So I created a new folder, which is a basic Python project default, because it's actually not a real project. Like, we're not going to code anything today. But the first thing that I'm going to do is create two folders. So the first one is going to be assets, and the second one is going to be tests. So what are those two folders for? Assets is basically for everything in my script that is going to be used and referenced, but is not a script. So it can be an HTML file if I only need a few. Obviously, if I did like a Flask project, I would have a proper Flask project architecture. But everything like images, notes, other type of files that are not like purely code files, but are just going to be referenced in the code, I would put in assets. Pretty obvious from the name. And tests is because you should never do any project without some kind of test, at least the very basic one, except if you're just like writing 5 lines of code, you don't need a test, but everything else should have tests. And so it's good to have a proper folder where your tests are, because you don't want them to be mixed with your other scripts, and I think it's just a cleaner way to approach things. Okay, then we're gonna move to a very important file according to me, that is especially on like personal project and like small GitHub repo that I see is often disregarded, is having a requirements.txt. That's I'm sure you know if you're watching this video, but it's just where you're gonna put every single Python package that you're gonna use. And you should always put the version as well, because I have lost track of how many times I tried to run old projects where I didn't specify the version of the package. And obviously, with the time, the package had some kind of updates and the code wasn't working. And then you have to suddenly debug a project that you haven't touched in years. So just put the version, save yourself the trouble for later. Obviously, there are also more advanced things, like there's a TOML file that you can use, but that requires lots of like different pip file installation. So I think requirements.txt is just like the most basic but simple and works for most cases. And unless you're doing a huge project, which then would have anyway a different structure probably and like custom to the project, this is just enough for any basic stuff. So it's good to start with that at least. Then another one that is often forgotten for small personal project is to have a little readme, even though it's going to be empty obviously now. I think it's very important to create it early on, because that way you're kind of forcing yourself to fill it out as time goes by. Especially now with AI, you have no excuse not to have an empty file. But yeah, just create it, get it done, and then fill it out as you write your project. It's much, much, much nicer than having to fill in that at the end. And sometimes I actually also use it just to date. Like if I'm gonna work on a project over like a month, I'm gonna date, and it's kind of gonna be the like journal of the project, which I think is actually a very fun way to look back at some technical choices where you did certain things that you did before, because it happens very often that you do something initially at the start of the project and then you're like, this doesn't work, so you change it, but then later on you're like, wait, what was the thing that I did at the start, or like what was the other way that this was working? And it's good to have just the like history of that, because obviously any project should be on Git that you use, but come on, we all know that for our personal projects, we don't commit nearly as often as we should. So it's also good to have like a written and like explanations written down of our choices, because I know your commit messages are not going to be super extensive. Two more like very basic file is an M file. Should always have those, because I mean, even if you need to like run your project on a special port or anything, you'll want to reference that in your project, and it's just much cleaner than having all those variables in your scripts. Sometimes I even put like just most of my like Python variables into this when it just makes sense to do it, and it's just cleaner to look at, especially if you have multiple scripts. It's just much easier to have everything in an env file. And lastly, and like the basic, we're gonna have our git ignore, and we're gonna put our m file. Better to do it at first, because I mean, very classic to start your project, write your whole script, and then forget to put your .env in your git ignore, and then you commit actual variables that should not be on GitHub in GitHub. So just get it out of the way. I think those are all those small steps that you want to do at the start of your project, and just save yourself the headache of thinking about it later or accidentally leaking some kind of like API key that should say private. Then we're just gonna have our like scripts that we're gonna do for today. Is just I'm just gonna be doing some very advanced Python programming, which is just a classic hello world. Doesn't fail, because here I'm not actually trying to write any Python. It's just so that we have something once we run the project that like proves to us that our project works. And then lastly, we're gonna have a Docker file. Same thing as sort of the requirements txt before. I have had many times where I tried to run old projects that were written in like older versions of Python, and I completely forgot about it. So having a Docker file to run your project is just much easier. Also very convenient when it has happened before that I had to share a project with someone that was, for instance, on Mac while I'm on Windows. And you know, the trouble of trying to make something work on different OS with Docker file is just gets it out of the way. Will work for everyone's PC, so very easy to share your project later on and just run it like years later. You know that it will still work. So the first thing we're gonna do is specify our Python version for our project. Here I'm going with the classic 3.11. Pick whatever you want, whatever. I have to say, I don't think it matters super much to have a specific version, except if you know if some of your packages are only compatible with certain versions. But otherwise, usually I just specify what like default Python version I'm currently using. But it's really to be able to run it over a long period of time. Then we're gonna specify this, like our work directory. I mean, those are just very classic files. We're not gonna learn anything about Docker that you probably don't already know, but just about covering your basics. And then having our requirements.txt copied into the Docker file. Then since we have our file, might as well install pip and install our requirements. Okay, perfect. Then we're gonna add one line for any other files and like copying all the assets and stuff that we have in there. For instance, here it's empty, but it's just to make sure that every time we run our container, we don't forget any file. And then we will just do the like default run of our container, which will be, in our case, running our main script. So yeah, this is pretty much what it looks like. I mean, it's nothing very fancy. Hopefully you know what all of these commands are. If you don't, just look up any Docker container and like Docker tutorial and you will know in like 10 minutes. But it's just, you know, to get things clean and like everything well organized before getting started. And so now all that's left to do is to actually build our app or our script. First our container. So we're going to do a classic Docker build. It's going to build everything for us. And then we're going to do starting our container. God, I've typed that comment honestly so many times that now I just like remember it by heart. But for a very, very long time, I actually like could not get it stuck in my head, and so I always had like my notes app or something with the comment next to it. But now I've typed so many times, it's like, you know, those old passwords that like I have the same thing with like my Wi-Fi password, where even though it's a very annoying like string of characters, I've just typed it so many times that I know it by heart. Okay, so now we are in the actual container that we created, and just to check, we have all the files that we want. So our Docker file, our README, our assets folder, our tests folder, and then our script and our requirements. You can see that it didn't copy the .env and .ignore. That's the like default behavior, and that's good because you don't want your .env file to be in the container by default, because that means if you share it with someone else, maybe you have private keys that you don't want to be shared. You don't want that to be also in the Docker, so it's best if everyone has their own like env file that they have with their own credentials and stuff like that. Same for the git ignore, that way you can each specify what files you don't want to commit to git and things like that. Whenever, in this case, our env file is empty, so it's not really important, but if I had important variables in it, I would just add in the comment the like env file.env. Okay, I wrote it in the file. I meant to write it in the terminal, but that's fine. I would just add that parameter to the docker run comment, and that way we'd have the env file actually in the Docker file. So then we could check that everything works by just running our Python, and it works. Okay, that was very, very easy. One last thing that I would recommend, especially if you're on Linux or Mac, is to have a run.sh file, and then you can just save your docker build and docker run command to like just run that sh file and like bash file, basically bash script, and just run that script instead of having to memorize the command every time you want to start your Docker. I think on Windows there's an equivalent, and I'm forgetting the name of the specific file. Or you can also just save it as like a command that you can type directly in your terminal. That's actually what I do for projects that I run often, or like at work. I have a bunch of like shortcuts that I just type in my terminal, and it starts everything. Much easier than typing this very long command every time, but it's good to practice on small projects typing it, because it's just good to be able to have it off of the top of your head. And that's actually it for this pretty straightforward tutorials. I mean, nothing super complicated. I'm curious if you have any other like files that you would put in any default project, or if you'd want more in-depth architectures of like specific projects, maybe like Flask project or stuff like that, please let me know in the comments. And once again, if you want to download all of those files so you can just copy paste everything that I just did today, you can just click the link in the description, enter your email, and then you'll get the folders with all the files, and that way you can just copy that basic structure every time for any new project. But I encourage you to personalize and add your own like little tricks and little things that you find really useful in your project, and I will see you in the next video.